Ladies and gentlemen, let's get started. We're waiting for Mr. Auchincloss, but we're going to fit him in as time permits when he gets back.
Yeah, there was a coup.
What?
There was a coup on the Democratic side.
Oh, was it? And we have the victor right here, Mr. Torres. But so we'll see if we can get this situated. Microphone's working. So as you know, we're being live streamed today, so it's an informal conversation, but we wanted to share with as many people as possible. So thank you for joining me today for the third session of our Fentanyl Policy Working Group. I'm Dan Newhouse from the state of Washington. As you know, at our first meeting, we explored how to strengthen U.S. enforcement in the face of the fentanyl epidemic. Today, something very important, we'll discuss how to go on offense in the old-fashioned way by following the money. The last time we faced such a novel money laundering challenge was after September 11th. Terrorist organizations use the age-old informal Hawala system to move money under the radar of U.S. and allied law enforcement. We quickly caught on, fortunately, and we built a system to deal with that challenge. We called it terrorist financing. Now we need to explore a similar system. Chinese money launderers have taken terrorist money laundering playbook and digitized it. They use modern technologies, messaging and payment apps, e-commerce sites, digital assets, and the opaque nature of the Chinese banking system to move large sums of money and facilitate trade-based money laundering with impunity. This system largely evades the formal banking system in the United States and in Mexico and elsewhere, making it particularly difficult to counter with traditional anti-money laundering tools. But you should make no mistake, the CCP financing system runs right through Chinese banks, and the CCP knows all about it. Retired Admiral Craig Fowler, the former head of the U.S. Southern Command, has warned that the Chinese government is at least tacitly supporting money laundering. I'd probably go one step further. The illicit financing of the fentanyl trade is state-sponsored by the PRC. Xi Jinping, as the Select Committee detailed in its investigation, has doubled down on the PRC's alliance with transnational Chinese criminal organizations. Chinese state actors protect these organizations from U.S. prosecution, and CCP elites even use the CCP threat financing network to enrich themselves. Probably not a surprise. The CCP threat financing system exploits gaps in our existing anti-money laundering laws and regulations. We must take aggressive steps to fill those gaps and here's 3 examples of how we could accomplish that. Number 1, ensuring that all PRC-based applications used to launder fentanyl proceeds, such as WeChat Pay, register as money service businesses. Number 2, addressing the use of PRC-based e-commerce applications and sites to move fentanyl and fentanyl precursors and the revenue from those sales. And then number 3, cracking down on PRC-based financial institutions and money transmitters who moved drug proceeds and profit from the deaths of Americans and our allies. The U.S. needs a modernized system that confronts the novel use of web-based applications and digital currencies, and that recognizes the PRC's central role in the financing of the fentanyl crisis. So we are very fortunate to have joining us today 3 experts in anti-money laundering enforcement and in the CCP's threat financing network. First of all, Mr. Don Im. Welcome, Mr. Im. Mr. Im retired in November of 2022 as an assistant special agent in charge after 32 years with the Drug Enforcement Administration. While with the DEA, Dom also spent 28 years in the U.S. Army Reserves, retiring as a lieutenant colonel with U.S. Special Operations Command. In his role at the DEA, Dom conducted and supported hundreds of drug money laundering and narco-terrorism investigations, including by developing policies, initiatives, and operations to address Chinese triads and PRC state-owned enterprises involved in the opioid fentanyl crisis and their funding streams. So welcome, Mr. M. John Cassara, did I say that correctly? Cassara? Began his 26-year tour of government service as an intelligence officer during the Cold War. He later served as a Treasury Special Assistant with both the Secret Service and Customs, investigating money laundering and trade fraud. After six years with the Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, or FinCEN, Mr. Cassara's final government position came at the Treasury's Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. He's an author of China, Specified Unlawful Activities, CCP Inc., Transnational Crime and Money Laundering. And perhaps most interesting of all those things, at one point he spent 2 years undercover as an arms dealer.
I can tell you some stories.
Oh, well, hopefully we can get to some of those.
That's so badass.
You brought cash with you today, did you? And then we have Alex Zerden. Alex is the founder of Capital Peak Strategies, a risk advisory firm based in Washington, D.C. Alex has worked across the U.S. government, including at the White House National Economic Council, in the House and Senate, and at the Treasury Department, including as Treasury Attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Kabul as a financial attaché. In addition to Capital Peak, Alex is also an adjunct senior fellow at CNAS, a senior advisor to West Exec Advisors, and a term member at the Council on Foreign Relations. So Alex, welcome to you as well. So I'm certain that we will all benefit from your presence today. So thank you very much for being here. I would turn to Mr. Auchincloss as soon as he arrives. We'll do that. So we want to hear from you. We want to spend as much time as we can gleaning as much as you know about this subject, and we'll have time for an exchange and some questions. So I'm going to just start on my right. Mr. Im, the microphone is yours.
Should I turn the microphone on or?
I believe it's on.
Can you hear me?
You're good.
All right, good. Okay. All right. Chairman Newhouse, and Auchincloss, members of the working group, I want to thank you for inviting me here to speak on this committee on one of the most important threats facing our nation. In my opening statement, what I'd like to do is just describe exactly how Chinese criminal enterprises are using trade-based money laundering. Okay, just a basic foundation of how this takes place globally. Okay, how this helps cycle the billions of dollars in fentanyl and other illicit drugs that leads to the deaths of tens of thousands of Americans every month. After my opening statement, I'll follow up with the primary factors that drive these Chinese money launderers to facilitate their criminal activities unimpeded, and what efforts the United States government can take to help mitigate this crisis. Okay. So with that, I'm just going to describe, in my 30-some years with the DEA, how these Chinese money launderers are functioning. Okay. So it starts off with a contract. Okay. They call it a contract. Okay. So let's assume that the Sinaloa cartel, right, just sold $1 million worth of fentanyl and methamphetamine in New York City. Okay, that pile of cash is now secured in an apartment in Queens, New York. All right, the head of that drug cell in New York, Queens, New York City, will contact his superior in Mexico, the Sinaloa cartel financier, and state that the cash has been counted and it's ready for delivery. The Sinaloa cartel financier in Mexico will then reach out to various Chinese Mexican businessmen who will operate as money launderers and money brokers. They own businesses, they own shopping malls, they sell all kinds of products, namely from China. Okay? So once a Chinese Mexican businessman agrees to the terms to sell or to buy the cash sitting in New York City from the cartel, okay, at 0 or 3 to 3% commission, meaning that the Chinese will charge 0% or 3% to the Mexican cartel to buy or launder those proceeds, okay, in order for the cartel to recoup his profit. Normally, we've been seeing 0%, meaning that the Chinese are just outright laundering that $1 million. Okay, so what will happen is once a buyer is identified and the agreement is reached, the Chinese-Mexican businessman will then notify his Chinese contact in New York City, okay, a network, to go pick up that pile of cash from the Sinaloa drug sale head. Okay, so they'll do it at a busy parking lot in a mall somewhere. Okay, so the Chinese New York network will then use a courier to go pick up that cash. Normally a student paid $1,000 to go pick up that cash from the Sinaloa cartel member. Once that's done and that $1 million in bulk cash is secured, he will then notify the Chinese-Mexican businessman in Mexico that he's now secured with that $1 million. As soon as that's done, the Chinese-Mexican businessman in Mexico will transfer $1 million equivalent in pesos to the Mexican cartel. Now, the Mexican cartel, his hands are clean, he's got his profit, and there's no link from that drug profit in New York City to his bank account in Mexico. So then what happens? On the back end, the Chinese-Mexican businessman will then auction those US dollars, the $1 million, okay, sitting in New York City, okay, on WeChat for various Chinese citizens in China to buy that $1 million. Okay, so on WeChat, they have these various social media rooms, and people have to either find a way to join in these rooms that are looking to buy these dollars. So there's an auction of that $1 million in New York on WeChat. And once an individual in China agrees to the terms, just say 10%, meaning that that person will pay $100,000 extra to buy that $1 million. Okay? So once that's agreed upon, the Chinese citizen will be instructed to send $1.1 million in renminbi, Chinese currency, to various Chinese manufacturing companies in China. Okay? So $1.1 million in renminbi will be transferred to various manufacturing companies for various products and commodities for export to the Chinese-Mexican businessman. So once that takes place, the Chinese-Mexican businessman will receive a cargo containing $1.1 million worth of commodities that he or she will sell throughout Mexico from his various shopping malls and stores, whereby he will not only recoup that million, but also make additional profit. Okay. So now what happens to that $1 million held by the Chinese New York network? That person in their network will then structurally deposit that $1 million in cash throughout various bank accounts of restaurants, little shops owners, little shops, gas stations, laundry stores, and that $1 million will then get pulled into one or two bank accounts. Those funds could be converted into cryptocurrency or put into offshore havens in a front company or a shell company, okay? But now that $1 million sits in an account somewhere that's structurally deposited, and it's now owned by the Chinese citizen who shipped $1.1 million worth of goods to Mexico. So now the Chinese citizen in China can decide what he or she wants to do with that $1 million sitting in New York City in those various bank accounts. It could be used to purchase real estate, or it could be used for escrow accounts for their children's college tuition. It could be used to purchase high-value real estate items and so forth. And again, this is not the only way, but this is the primary way in which you're seeing indirect transfers of funds and value without having the Chinese citizen to actually transfer $1.1 million outside the country, because there are restrictions and they are being monitored. Okay, so once that takes place and the Chinese-Mexican businessman receives his goods, that balances his books, everything's reconciled. And those profits that he generates from those goods that he sells in Mexico, that again then creates profits in pesos, and that becomes the ad hoc bank for the cartels to come in next time if there's, say, €1 million sitting in London of cocaine that was sold. And thereby the cycle continues. And this happens every day, every week, throughout major markets, drug markets in North America and Europe. And you're seeing literally $500 billion to $750 billion worth of drug proceeds generated every year. So this bypasses our ability to find that nexus between the drug proceeds in New York with those commodities that are shipped into Mexico. That makes it more challenging. And throughout my years with doing undercover operations with the DEA, penetrating these money laundering organizations, we're able to see and acquire understanding on how they're actually doing this. So I will follow through afterwards with any questions you may have, and 6 factors that, in my opinion, are help driving Chinese money laundering.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hopefully it'll draw.
Mr. Cassara.
Good afternoon, everybody. Representatives Newhouse, Auchincloss, and members of the working group, it's an honor for me to be here. Before I begin my remarks here, I'd just like to add 2 things to what Don said. One of the things that makes this so difficult for U.S. criminal investigators is the fact that it almost completely avoids our primary anti-money laundering countermeasure, which is financial intelligence. The 20-odd million pieces of financial intelligence is filed with Treasury's FinCEN every year. There's no paper trail to follow, if you will. And that's what we've been relying on so much to fight this war against, money laundering. We don't have that kind of record because they successfully bypass it. The other thing he kind of inferred, but I just wanted to reinforce, you probably know this already, but in China, there's capital restrictions on how much an individual Chinese citizen can send out of the country every year. It's about $50,000 equivalent. So that's why they want to get their hands on US dollars, because if they do want to buy that expensive property or invest or pay for their child's education, whatever it is, they need dollars, and it's hard to get out of China.
That's why the demand.
Yeah, that's why there's such a high demand. Continuing with my remarks, Communist China is an ideological, military, economic, commercial, high-tech, intelligence, and diplomatic rival of the U.S. and the West. And while these threats are known, the Chinese Communist Party's involvement with transnational crime and money laundering is not. While I applaud the findings and recommendations in the Select Committee's recent report on the CCP's role on the fentanyl crisis, we cannot look at the fentanyl issue in a vacuum or as an isolated concern. My most recent book, you all have a copy, is China Specified Unlawful Activities. And I talk about Chinese transnational crime and money laundering. In researching the book, I found that CCP Inc.'s business model that fuels the fentanyl crisis is also active in many other sectors of crime. Using a law enforcement perspective based on my career, I examined the 12 most significant categories of transnational crime. And I found that criminal activity has seemingly become part of the CCP's overall strategy to grow its power. By measuring the illicit proceeds of crime generated, China leads the world in all of those criminal categories. Each of these transnational crimes are also what we call specified unlawful activities, or SUAs, to charge money laundering, sometimes known as predicate offenses for money laundering. CCP Inc.'s involvement in transnational crime, if you total all this up, is at least $2 trillion, and I think that's an underestimate, or approximately half of the estimated $4 trillion that is laundered annually around the world every year. In my book, I also discussed a number of Chinese-centric money laundering methodologies and enablers, used by CCP Inc., including underground banking, capital flight, gaming, real estate, the use of offshores and secrecy jurisdictions. Chinese actors also use black market exchanges, Bai Chen or flying money, the Chinese equivalent of hawala, Mr. Newhouse mentioned, and trade-based money laundering and value transfer. Corruption, what I call the great facilitator for money laundering, is also rampant. Chinese Inc. has taken their domestic corruption and has exported it overseas. CCP Inc. also excels in what we call elite capture and influence operations. Other enablers include Chinese organized crime, espionage, social monitoring, the promotion of Chinese control of international free trade zones, the Belt and Road Initiative and exploitative presence in the developing world, the lack of Chinese cooperation in international law enforcement, and poor Chinese anti-money laundering compliance. It's important to remember that the CCP is the PRC is a command state. For example, the CCP could easily block websites that advertise fentanyl and other dangerous drugs and precursors. They choose not to. I wish to emphasize that the SUAs, the money laundering methodologies and enablers cannot be viewed in isolation. We must look at the totality of the CCP's criminal malfeasance. These issues that we're talking about, they're all intertwined and must be addressed collectively. But the good news is that CCP Inc.'s international law-breaking, corruption, and capital flight makes its communist elite exposed and vulnerable. We should prioritize the rule of law and avail ourselves of our tremendous intelligence and law enforcement resources and expertise and go after them. And it's past time that we do so. In my book, I conclude with recommendations that emphasize law enforcement. And some of those recommendations include develop intelligence tasking so that our intelligence services will report on Chinese transnational crime and money laundering. Develop a U.S. law enforcement strategic plan focused on CCP Inc. criminality. Establish regional CCP Inc. law enforcement task forces. Explore ways to allow the victims of CCP crime here in the United States to pursue civil forfeiture action. Reinvigorate anti-money laundering gatekeeping and registration rules. Work with the Financial Action Task Force, the world's premier anti-money laundering body, to name and shame China. In other words, humiliate them for being a criminal enterprise. Prioritize illicit proceeds and go after the money. However, when I talk about money laundering, we talk about money laundering here and following the money, I have to caution realism, and we'll give you the true story here. But in measuring the efficacy of our current anti-money laundering efforts, the metrics that matter for money laundering enforcement are forfeitures and successful investigations and prosecutions. And these metrics suggest that both in the United States and around the world, we're failing. One expert said we are a decimal place or a decimal point away from total failure. We fail 99.9% of the time. There are many reasons for this failure, and I would be happy to discuss them with you and answer any questions you may have.
John? Mr. Zerg?
Thank you. Representative Newhouse and Auchincloss and members of the Select Committee, good afternoon. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify before you. Many years ago, I began my federal service working for true luminaries, Senators Carl Levin and Senator John McCain, on the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigation. During the Trump administration, I deployed to Afghanistan to lead the U.S. Treasury Department's office and go after these people that Mr. Newhouse mentioned: drug traffickers, illegal hawala dealers, terrorist financiers, corrupt officials, and economic sanctionators, with our interagency partners and with our host nation partners. I had the opportunity to return to Congress to work as legal counsel on the Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Crisis to identify and disrupt waste, fraud, and abuse of pandemic-related federal economic assistance. And this has often included sophisticated efforts by transnational criminal organizations to exploit our assistance programs. As a national security professional, I'm incredibly encouraged to see the bipartisan bicameral efforts to illuminate China's role in the fentanyl crisis. However, we must collectively continue to move beyond admiring the problem. This is a term I take from DoD colleagues in the Defense Department, talking about threat finance issues, and really take concrete actions. So a few proposals I just want to close with for my recommendations. Congress needs to fund national security priorities. I realize the resource question is always a tough issue, but I wrote in War on the Rocks several weeks ago, Congress should sufficiently resource key economic national security positions and functions. Where needed, authorize additional capabilities. This includes the FinCEN Domestic Liaison Program to put FinCEN officers around the country, as well as the Foreign Financial Intelligence Unit Liaison Program to dispatch our personnel overseas. This was all authorized under the 2020 Anti-Money Laundering Act that you all voted, or that many of you all voted for. Congress should create and fund a Treasury Department Foreign Financial Service akin to the Foreign Service for the State Department, Agriculture Service, and Commerce. And that will strengthen our U.S. economic national security overseas. I had the privilege to serve in one of these positions. There are roughly only about a dozen around the world. We need many, many more. I also believe that Congress can create a reserve corps built on how the military operates for Treasury Department and other key national security positions for our economic national security priorities, so that we have that excess capacity in times of crisis, as well as to address a crisis like fentanyl. Lastly, we need to significantly increase congressional appropriations for state, for commerce, and for Treasury in these national economic security arenas. We appropriate a tremendous amount for DoD. They do incredible work. Same for our intelligence community, but we expect too much out of our civilian economic national security bureaucracy, and we don't resource them nearly enough. I'm happy to also talk about revenue streams, about how to increase the top line so we can find other ways to provide for this, and happy to go into that in further detail. And then on a technical level, the Treasury Department can also explore using its existing authorities with your support, including USA Patriot Act Section 311, to more creatively apply its use to address the fentanyl crisis. So what does this look like? It's normally a prohibition on certain account opening, account maintenance procedures for international cross-border accounts. There's also record keeping and reporting requirements, which has only been used one time. And this could be an additional way that we track the flow of funds, we track the sources of fentanyl proceeds or fentanyl precursor proceeds or other malign activities emanating from China, emanating from other third countries. But the authorities exist and they may need to be strengthened. But I can't understate the value, as John was discussing and Don was discussing, in particular, the value of lawfully collected financial intelligence. And this is something that law enforcement and our regulators do, and it is crucial to solving this issue set. Second, Congress can provide the support to address existing risks in the U.S. financial system. Chinese money laundering organizations can easily own and control U.S. companies, often with less documentation than is required to get a library card. If implemented successfully, beneficial ownership information resources will help law enforcement and financial regulators. Additionally, recent proposals to increase the regulatory perimeter for anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism, AML-CFT, for the real estate sector and investment advisors is a step in the right direction, brings us into international compliance, and shows the ability to adapt to evolving threats, including those posed by fentanyl and those who profit from it. Third, and this is consistent with what Mr. Cassara was talking about, Congress can help mobilize the full force of the private sector and international partners in the fight against fentanyl trafficking in Chinese money laundering organizations. This starts with creating more effective incentives for people like whistleblowers to come forward and report financial crimes, including money laundering. It continues by creating, this is what Mr. Cassara talked about, and constantly upgrading our legal system to allow victims and the government to obtain and enforce civil remedies, civil judgments against fentanyl traffickers, Chinese money laundering organizations, and other malign actors to go higher up the value chain and impose substantial costs against these actors. Lastly, Congress can support Justice, Treasury, and State departments when working with allies and partners overseas, including through the Intergovernmental Financial Action Task Force, or FATF, a body that was designed in the late 1980s during the drug war to combat drug-related money laundering, expanded to terrorism financing after the horrific 9/11 attacks, and has now taken on other mandates, including corruption and proliferation financing, weapons proliferation. So this is something that we can utilize to have a multilateral international effort to tackle Chinese efforts on fentanyl production and transport and product. So I really thank you for the opportunity. I look forward to your questions. And again, thank you for all the hard work you're doing in this bipartisan effort.
Thank all of you. Next, I'd like to turn to Ranking Member Auchincloss, if you'd like to offer any comments. Happy to do that.
I appreciate it. Apologies for coming late. I was actually doing something else about fentanyl. I promise I wasn't playing hooky. Thank you for being here. And really just want to note the interest of this working group in understanding the money laundering challenge in particular. I think in our last meeting, a lot of conviction around sanctions and joint task force. Money laundering has felt like trying to put socks on an octopus, to borrow a phrase from my colleague. And so this is going to be very helpful, I think, for all of us to better understand the issue and also the pressure points. Can I ask one question as well?
Sure.
Civil forfeiture action, is that the same as private right of action?
I understand it differently. So civil forfeiture is run by the Department of Justice. And as I understand it, private right of action is for individuals.
For individuals, yes.
To pursue cause of actions.
So civil forfeiture action, say more than about how that could play a role in helping with this problem.
So there's civil and criminal forfeiture. I'm less of an expert, I believe, than these two, but I'm happy to just briefly opine that it would allow law enforcement to go after the proceeds of crime through seizure actions, and so that arrests the funds and allows for potential
Without a conviction.
without a conviction.
That's the answer.
So it's the property. It's not an individual. It doesn't have to be associated with an individual's conviction.
Civil as well, without a conviction. Got it. And do those authorities not currently exist for DOJ for the proceeds of fentanyl trafficking?
They exist, but they're not being enforced.
Got it.
Thank you.